Spoilers for Elbaf and Dressrosa, so you have been warned. But Bartolomeo, the captain of the Barto Club and the captain of the second ship of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet, gets his ship, the Going Luffy Senpai, blasted away by Yasopp of the Red Hair Pirates. This is funny because Yasopp is the father of Usopp, and Usopp is Bartolomeo's superior, technically. So, with that being said, I think his ship is the only ship that is going to be totally made over, both crew and vessel. Because even though I don't think Bartolomeo is dead, obviously not, that doesn't mean the rest of the crew survived. However, I do think he will find an unlikely ally in a former enemy of Luffy's that we get reintroduced to during the events of Dressrosa, and of whom he has a slight relationship with. And I'm not talking about Cavendish. So, interestingly, in chapter 731, Bartolomeo actually defends Bellamy from an enraged Dillinger by putting up a barrier to protect him. I think this is the start of a friendship that will blossom later on in the series, because it's quite funny how the two are so dynamically opposed to one another, but end up being allies with Luffy for better or for worse, even though Bellamy didn't exactly agree to be a part of the Grand Fleet. I think he will in the future. But to break things down, 1, animal motifs. Bartolomeo is called a rooster throughout the events of the Dressrosa arc. This is very interesting now because a rooster is often associated with the dawn, and Luffy, as of the end of Wano, is the sun deity thanks to his devil fruit. So that's interesting within itself, especially seeing as how Bartolomeo has an affinity for Luffy. However, on the flip, Bellamy is actually called Bellamy the Hyena. Now, a hyena is often associated with laughter. Laughter is something that Luffy does a lot of in Gear 5th. So that's a point there. Secondly, the hyena is dynamically opposed to the rooster in the way that it is a nocturnal creature. It comes out at night. What's interesting about this is that Luffy transforms into Gear 5th for the first time under the full moon at night. So that is interesting. However, when you're talking about the devil fruits of Bartolomeo and Bellamy, they parallel very interestingly, because both of them are paramecia type devil fruit users. However, they are dynamically opposed because Bellamy's whole shtick in being the user of the spring fruit or the boing boing fruit is that he moves around at very high speeds. So much so that in the post time skip, he is called the Deadly Bullet of Dressrosa as a second epithet for him. However, Bart is opposed to him in this way because Bart is the user of the barrier fruit. So his strength is standing stationary while his barrier does all the work, in which he takes damage in from his opponents using his barrier and flings that damage right back at them. Now, what is so interesting about this is these powers in relation to Luffy himself, because for starters, we know that Bartolomeo references Luffy, because before he became a pirate, he was trying out all of Luffy's techniques, but in his fight with Claudius during the Dressrosa arc, he actually performs a technique that references Luffy directly called Berry Berry Pistol, obviously referencing the Gum Gum Pistol. So that's a thing. But to continue, but you could say Luffy is referencing both Bellamy and Bartolomeo through the use of Gear 4th. So first off, Luffy has always had very similar properties to Bartolomeo's barriers, with the various uses of Gum Gum Balloon, in which he takes in an attack and flings it right back at the opponent. That much is true, and even in the concept of him being made of rubber, he's always on par with Bartolomeo in that way. The whole idea of bouncing back damage to your opponent. So they have that in common. However, However, the interesting thing about him and Bellamy is that, of course, you know that Luffy fought Bellamy in the pre-time skip during the events of Jaya. And based on Luffy's track record, he always is referencing people he's fought before. And that comes to the forefront in Dressrosa when facing off against Doflamingo, in which he goes Gear 4th Bound Man or Bounce Man, in which he utilizes the power of springiness against Doflamingo. This is very similar to the entire power set of Bellamy, especially now in Dressrosa when we find out that he does utilize his fists when using his spring fruit powers. And that's Luffy's whole ideal in using Gear 4th Bound Man, using the power of bounciness and springiness to amplify his muscled and hockeyed up body, which I find super interesting. Now, what's also quite interesting about this is that in Whole Cake Island, when fighting Cracker, he goes Gear 4th Tank Man full version. This, more so than any other technique at that point, feels like a direct reference to Bartolomeo, because he's literally baiting the opponent to attack him only for him to fire the opponent back into his own constructs, which are kind of like barriers. So I just find that parallel super interesting. But getting back to the characters in question, both Bartolomeo and Bellamy have tattoos on their chests. However, this is another interesting parallel because we know what Bellamy's tattoo is. It's the Jolly Roger of the Don Quixote Pirates, because Doflamingo was once Bellamy's idol. So we'll have to see if that tattoo changes in the future. However, we don't know what Bart's tattoo actually is or what it means. So that's kind of funny in hindsight. But in talking about the people whom they look up to, they parallel very nicely against one another as well, because Bellamy lived for the approval of Don Quixote Doflamingo, only to be let down and used as a tool. However, Bartolomeo always looked up to Luffy and actually got a reward for it by being the second ship of the newly christened Straw Hat Grand Fleet. However, this did lead him into a bit of trouble, kind of like Bellamy, because he picked a fight with the red-haired pirates, and it led to him having his ship being blown up. So nuts to him on that front. However, I do think when the two come together and form a crew, I don't think the Barto Club will be the name of the new crew. I think they could be called the Bounce Back Pirates, because both of their movesets do involve bouncing back, essentially. Bellamy literally bouncing around the area, whereas Bart bounces back damage at an opponent. Also, narratively, both of them are bouncing back, because Bart, in this way, if he's still alive, which I think he is bouncing back from having his ship blown up by a Yonko crew and disgracing Luffy by messing with the territory of his mentor, Red-Haired Shanks. However, Bellamy is bouncing back from having his life torn to pieces by Don Quixote Doflamingo and rebuilding a new life for himself. So it's interesting in that way to call them the Bounce Back Pirates, because it's narratively appropriate. However, if you are enjoying the content so far, I would appreciate it if you hit the like button, followed by the subscribe button if you are really enjoying the content and want to see more. But to ensure that you do see more, don't forget to ring that bell so you never miss a Poly Works video. On top of that, I would appreciate it if you could hit the hype button, because it does help somehow. But with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Poly Works.